A man hiked through the desert and snapped a photo by a large rock. Shortly after, he experienced a terrifying ordeal and soon found himself making headlines nationwide. Gary, 53, loved challenging himself by surviving in nature. His latest goal was to spend a week alone in the Sonoran Desert in eastern Colorado. His wife always worried when he took on these adventures, thinking they were too dangerous, especially alone. But for Gary, that was the point. He believed survival only mattered if it was a real challenge. So he set off into the desert with just his essentials: water, a tent, a knife, his survival kit, and the clothes he wore. He left his phone behind to fully experience survival, taking only a disposable camera to capture his journey. When he put his phone in the glove compartment, he thought of his wife's disapproval. If she knew this, she'd kill him. Gary went into the desert. He had about 2 hours until sunset, so he had to find a place to set up his tent. Around him were signs that read, "Do not enter the desert alone," and "Watch out for the heat." Gary just ignored the signs. After a few kilometers, the sign stopped, and he was completely alone in the middle of nowhere. He saw a large rock that was perfect for him to set up his tent. It wasn't in the open air, so the wind wouldn't be able to blow his tent away. By now, it was only a few moments before sunset, so Gary pitched his tent and made a small fire. All of a sudden, he noticed something. The rock was beautiful, he thought, as he glanced at the small stone formation in front of him. He had to take a quick picture of it before it got dark. He found a stick and grabbed a rope from his bag. He tied his camera to it and took a picture. Soon after, it got dark, so Gary decided to head to bed early. He needed all his energy for tomorrow. He fell asleep like a baby, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness. He slept well, but in the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up to a nasty sound that deeply frightened him. He woke up and heard something in the distance. It was a strange screaming sound that sounded almost human. It got louder and louder. Suddenly, his survival trip wasn't so much fun anymore. He considered going outside to take a look, but decided to stay in his sleeping bag, hoping the sound would soon stop. At that moment, the sound reappeared, now very close. He listened carefully and noticed it was a human voice. He grabbed his knife and crawled further under his sleeping bag. Suddenly, he heard a motorcycle in the background. The sound of a roaring car engine was getting closer and closer. He decided to take a cautious look. Gary slowly opened his tent and looked around. He saw nothing but darkness, so he decided to stand on a rock and continue looking out. Gary quickly grabbed his flashlight and climbed up the rock. It was pitch black, so he carefully walked step by step. He had to go a few steps up to see over the top to the other side. When he reached the summit, he looked over the rock and immediately stiffened. He saw 2 headlights coming at him at a fast pace. He quickly turned off his flashlight. A trembling sense of fear suddenly invaded his body. Had they seen him? And who could that be in no man's land? Gary hid behind a rock that rose right above the top of the mountain. He peeked and saw a car getting closer and closer. About 200 meters before the rock, the car stopped. Slowly, it became lighter outside, and 2 men got out with flashlights. They walked to the back of the truck and opened it. One of them pulled out a huge package and put it on the ground. It looked like a box. After they put the box down, they walked towards the rock. They stopped about 100 meters in front of Gary. Then Gary noticed that one of the men was holding a gun. Suddenly, they turned their flashlight toward Gary's direction. There was a loud shout from one of the men. "Hey, show yourself." A terrified Gary quickly hid behind the protruding rock, hoping they wouldn't find him. Every minute started to feel like an hour as he waited for what was going to happen. His wife was right. Why would he have gone into the desert without a phone? He couldn't wait to hug her again and say she was right. Slowly, Gary began to panic. The men repeated themselves and began shouting even louder. "Hey, where are you?" Gary realized it was only a matter of time before they found his tent. Just as he was beginning to make his way down, he heard a third voice. The voice came from behind the mountain where he stood. but not from the ground, from above. The third voice screamed back that he'd heard the men. They replied, "Yes, sir," got in the car, and drove off. Gary climbed out from behind the rock again and peeked over the top. The car was gone. He looked around. The coast seemed clear, so he quickly got off the mountain and walked back to his tent. He packed up his things and ran away. It took Gary a while to find his way back, but his trusty compass pointed him in the right direction. He found his car and drove home. When he arrived at his house, he walked in and went straight to his wife. Gary hugged her and promised never to go on a survival trip alone again. A few days later, Gary was still thinking about what had happened in the desert. He couldn't shake it off. Suddenly, his wife came home with the photos from his disposable camera developed. An enthusiastic Gary went to look through them immediately. But when he saw the picture in front of the rock, he froze and said, "Honey, call the police now." In the photo Gary took of himself by the rock, a cave was visible with a small light coming from it, looking like a hideout. He handed the photo to the police, and 2 days later, he became a hero. The police captured fugitive drug lord Con Madras, who had escaped from prison 2 months earlier, thanks to the clues in Gary's photo. To top it off, Gary received a $1,000 reward for his tip. The news even hailed him as an anonymous hero catches drug lord.